Committee members, if you would take your seats, we're going to start. We will first start with bill introductions, and for that purpose, I will recognize Representative.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Fed and State Committee. The bill is 22 RS 3225, and it's a proposition to amend Section 2 of Article 2 of the Constitution of the State of Kansas, providing for consecutive term limits for senators and representatives.
Thank you. And that will be a House concurrent resolution?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Without objection, committee. Thank you, Representative. Folks, we're going to start right off with a hearing. We have a large hearing today. I will make a warning to the audience. I will not tolerate any outburst, any applause, any jeering, or anything like that. This will be just like a courtroom, and if I need to evict you, I will evict you. Have no doubt about that. So it's just like sitting in church. Just sit there quietly so we can all listen, and that's the purpose of it. With that, I would look to the reviser for House Bill 2717. Mike, if you would be so kind.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this bill, House Bill 2717, deals with so-called sanctuary cities, and the Section 1 has some definitions that you might pay attention to. Law enforcement agency is one, and then municipal identification card is another one, means any document, card, or other instrument authorized or issued on behalf of a city or county and bearing a name, photograph, or other descriptive information of any individual intended to be used as a form of identification. New Section 2, the municipality shall, it says no municipality shall enact, implement, or enforce an ordinance, policy, or and so on that prohibits or in any way restricts a law enforcement officer or other employee from taking the following actions with regard to information of a citizenship or immigration status, lawful or unlawful, of an individual, including communicating or cooperating with federal officials, sending or receiving information from the United States Department of Homeland Security, obtaining or maintaining information, exchanging information with another federal, state, or local government entity, and provides that any ordinance, resolution, policy, and so on that would be void if they violated that. New Section 2 on page 2, it provides that a municipality should not limit or restrict the enforcement of federal immigration laws. Every law enforcement agency shall provide each law enforcement officer with a written notice that the law enforcement officer has a duty to cooperate with state and federal agencies and officials on matters pertaining to enforcement of state and federal laws governing immigration. Section 4, municipal identification card shall not be used to satisfy any requirement of state law for proof of identity, and each municipal identification card shall state on its face, not valid for state ID. Section 5, the enforcement of federal law and communications with federal agencies shall be done without regard to race, religion, gender, and so forth. Section 6 provides the Attorney General, county, or district attorney may bring an action to compel compliance with this law. And Section 7 amends Chapter 8 statute dealing with unlawful use of identification to include any municipal identification card as defined by Section 1. I do have a balloon amendment that has some technical amendments and so on, which I will distribute when the committee works the bill.
Thank you. Questions of the reviser? Yes, Representative, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under current law, does this require that communities cooperate with ICE, or is the cooperation voluntary?
That's a question I'll let somebody else answer. I think it's required, but I'll let you've got lots of folks here that are much more familiar with this than me.
Thank you.
Thank you. No further questions of the revisor? Representative Miller, you have a question?
For you, Mr. Chairman, if we already anticipate a balloon amendment, is there any way we can get that now so we don't have to wait for the spontaneous discussion?
I know it's a technical amendment that was raised by the revisor. I have no problems if he has it available.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if it is, we'll get it to Connie, and Connie will get it out to the committee. If that's agreeable. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Committee, I've looked at the time and the number of proponents and opponents. I try to give each side equal time on the proponents because we only have 1, 2, 3, 4 that we've given 5 minutes each. Any time that is not consumed by the proponents will be switched over to the opponents. With that, we will have the distinguished Attorney General of the state of Kansas, Derek Schmidt. Good morning, sir, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Good morning, members of the committee, and thank you for conducting this hearing. You have my written testimony. I certainly won't read it. Let me just try to summarize with some key points. First, I don't think there's any question that debate on immigration policy and immigration enforcement is one of the more animated conversations in our country. It has been for many years. It is likely to remain so for many years. And most of us, or at least I think it's a prevailing view, believe that the right answer to the question is for Congress to do its job. The management of immigration and citizenship policy is one of the few things vested expressly in the U.S. Constitution. We fight with the feds a lot over whether it's theirs or ours in terms of an exercise of authority, but this is an area we don't often fight because it's theirs. The federal Constitution vests it within Congress. Unfortunately, Congress has failed to do its job, and so states, and in this case municipalities, have felt the motivation to step into the gap. My own view, and this is ultimately the policy choice in front of you this morning, is to the extent that there are governments other than the federal government dealing with this issue or its consequences, ought we to have a situation where in Kansas, for example, there could be 700 different answers to the question of what do we do, because we have 600 plus cities and 100 plus counties, or ought that not to be the case? So my own view is there ought to be an expression of state policy on this. As you might imagine, my phone started ringing not long after the unified government took its recent action saying, what are you going to do? And my answer generally was not much, because there is no state law that speaks to this. So if you want there to be any uniformity in the state or its subdivisions responses, you're going to have to enact something. If you don't enact something, then we'll continue to unfold as we are, with individual local jurisdictions having the ability to decide how they wish to approach these sorts of matters. What we presented to you today is, I believe, a fairly targeted bill. It doesn't seek to extinguish everything that the unified government has done or the city of Lawrence has done. It seeks to focus on two specific areas: the role of law enforcement and the use of these municipal identification cards that the local government in this case has decided to create. It doesn't extinguish the ability to create those cards, but it does make clear that their efficacy is confined to the local jurisdiction that created them. And they can't be used to satisfy, for example, obligations that have been created under state law for proof of identification. With respect to the police piece, let me just kind of cut to the bottom line on what I believe the policy ought to be. You will ultimately decide. I think that our law enforcement officials should not ultimately be compelled to become what I would characterize as conscientious objectors to a policy that other leaders in their community disagree with. I think they ought to be free to enforce the law and to cooperate with other law enforcement authorities in the enforcement of the law, and that to the extent there's discretion expressed, it ought to be the discretion of law enforcement professionals on particular operations, not the discretion of political leaders who blanket, in a blanket manner, limit the ability of law enforcement cooperation. So with that, let me describe kind of how we got to this draft. We took a look at other states that have gone down the road of enacting state-level law. We chose Indiana as our base model. Why? Because it was pretty narrow and straightforward. Their law has been on the books since 2011, so it's not a recent enactment. It stood the test of time. It's been subjected to litigation. It's withstood that litigation, and it seemed to us to accomplish the sort of targeted thing we wanted, and at the same time to be a tested methodology. This bill does three things. It ensures that law enforcement is not gagged or restrained in its ability to communicate about or participate in enforcement actions related to immigration. It also provides that the municipal identification cards that are authorized by the local ordinance at issue here may not be used to satisfy any state requirement for identification. There's good reason for that. To get a state ID card, you have to prove citizenship. You don't have to in order to get the municipal identification card here. If a local government wants to have local ID cards for local purposes, that's their business. But if they create government-issued identification that can then be carried outside their jurisdiction or used within or without their jurisdiction to meet the requirements of state law, that is more than a local matter. That is a state matter that creates a loophole in state law if not filled. And then finally, if there are going to be these local municipal identification cards, there is a provision in the municipal ordinance from Kansas City that makes it a local misdemeanor to misuse them in certain ways. The challenge with that is that those local ordinances are enforceable in the local municipal court. And of course, once a municipal identification card is created, it's portable. It can be used outside of, in this case, Wyandotte County. It can be fraudulently used outside of Wyandotte County. Just as any other identification card can be fraudulently used, including state cards. And therefore, our suggestion is that the existing state law in Chapter 8 that makes it a crime to misuse state ID cards in certain ways be amended to also cover the misuse of these new locally issued cards. With respect to an amendment piece, the last thing I'd say, Mr. Chairman, then I'll be done. We took the Indiana statute. We worked it internally at the AG's office. We made a variety of changes to it. We gave that draft to the reviser, and that became this bill. Once that process was in motion and we'd already sent it over to Mike, we identified a couple of other things that we think further changes, departures from the Indiana base make sense. And so I've asked Mike to prep that, and whenever it's available, I mean, it's in my testimony describing it, but the actual balloon will come from the reviser. One is Section 3B of this, which is taken verbatim from the Indiana provision, requires law enforcement agencies to provide a written notice to their officers that they have to enforce immigration law. We think that's unnecessary. It made sense on its face, but as we looked at it, law enforcement officers in Kansas are already sworn to uphold federal and state law, both constitutions, and we think that oath is sufficient. We don't see a reason to require agencies to send a letter of notification to all of their officers. So I'd recommend striking 3B in its entirety. And the other change that will be in the language Mike has is in Section 5. That's the non-discrimination piece. Again, we lifted that directly from the Indiana statute. On further reflection, we think it makes more sense to recast that so it fits within the existing Kansas framework that prohibits racial and other bias-based policing, rather than creating this sort of freestanding and peculiarly structured, compared with Kansas law, mechanism. So same objective, but we think it makes more sense to put it within a Kansas framework. Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to stand down or stand for questions.
Thank you. And General, since I know you have a busy schedule today, I'd like to take questions now of you, then I'll let you leave. Would that be all right?
As you wish, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Questions for, yes, Representative Reese.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here this morning. I know this is a pretty strong issue that's coming out of my county. When you saw the ordinance come out of Wyandotte County, and you said you received a lot of calls, did you receive calls in favor of it also?
Oh, I'm sure we did, Representative. Actually, the initial calls were all opposed, but as soon as I said I think we ought to do something, then we started to get those on the other side as well.
So the local ID situation, I don't know the ins and outs with that local ID. Are there other communities in Kansas that does that?
I don't know, Representative. There may well be, there may not be. Perhaps your community had the misfortune of being high profile in your actions. I don't know. I haven't conducted a comprehensive review of statutes. I'm aware of the Lawrence ordinance that was adopted in the middle of the pandemic, and I'm aware of the ordinance in the unified government that's gotten a lot of attention. There may be others. I don't know the answer to that.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, and if my last, being what's going on, we're seeing the welcoming Wyandotte County ordinance and the situation going on around the world with people being welcome, immigrants, because of the torn countries. the wheat base in Ukraine and Russia is falling down, and Kansas may have to step up to supplement some of those issues. What do you feel our message is from Kansas if this goes through?
I think our message is we welcome those who follow the law and we respect local control on matters that don't have statewide implication. I think our message is also that ultimately the United States government has to decide the citizenship and immigration policies of this country, and that to the extent it has failed to do so, we understand that a patchwork of responses from every local jurisdiction is not the desirable alternative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here, Mr. Attorney General. So I'm the ranking minority member on the Commerce and Labor Committee. And so when I look at legislation, I'm always looking at it through an economic lens. I've also served on the Economic Recovery Committee, and we are experiencing a major workforce shortage in every type of sector. Can you speak to how legislation like this might, I have concerns that it might have a chilling effect on our local and state economies, in particular in regards to workforce, when we're hearing from so many employers that they're suffering and that they're looking for people. So have we thought about the potential economic implications of this?
Well, Representative, of course, I'm certainly aware of the political debate on the general subject of migration, immigration, citizenship, and how to handle those persons who are in the country unlawfully, the reality of that circumstance. So I'm very mindful of that. I would simply go back to my earlier point, which is to the extent, there's a desire, not today, that's not what's in front of us, but there's a desire to have a discussion about whether Congress has prudently adopted immigration policy that allows in and welcomes in those that we want in and keeps out those that ought to be kept out. I think that's a discussion that's long overdue in this country. But I don't believe that the alternative to, and that's where I think the question about workforce, for example, would be properly addressed. I don't believe the answer to that is to invite local jurisdictions to begin inviting their law enforcement officers to merely turn a blind eye as a remedy.
Thank you. Representative Heiberger. Last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here, Mr. Attorney General. Are you a supporter of the Convention of States?
I've never taken a firm position on that. I'm open to the idea, and if that's where folks in the country want to go, then that's where we'll go. It's not something I've stepped up and personally advocated.
Okay. The reason I asked is that last week we were being asked to vote on that resolution, and today we're being asked to make municipalities and counties here enforce the laws of the tyrannical and out of control federal government. So, just one more question. In the event that this body would pass medical marijuana legislation, do you believe that municipalities should be required to enforce federal drug law?
Well, I have a history on that, Representative, and those of you who represent the city of Wichita will recall it. I was engaged in litigation against the city of Wichita some years ago when something similar, I suppose, analogous occurred. There was a group of folks in Wichita decided that they wanted to ignore, in that case, in my view, both federal and state law related to marijuana, and set out to adopt a local ordinance that was contrary to state and federal law. I ultimately told them I didn't think they had the authority to do that. They disagreed, and ultimately the court settled it and agreed with us and struck down the local ordinance. So in some sense, I think that is analogous here. The difference, however, and this is an important one and why we're here today, the difference is in that case, there was clear federal law and clear state law contrary to the ordinance. In this case, I think it is less clear that there certainly is not state law, and it's federal law sort of the opposite way. It's not prohibitory. It's a different structure. So if you want the outcome of no local action, you're going to have to enact something. And if you don't, then you've made a policy decision.
Thank you, sir. And General, when you came today, I didn't think you probably didn't know you were going to be serenaded.
No, but it sounds beautiful here on the Ides of March, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for coming here today. We're going to move right along. We've got a number of people to hear from. Thank you. Next up will be Brian Zakaski with the Assistant Deputy Secretary of State. Good morning, sir, and welcome. I'm going to move you down to 3 minutes. Thank
Not
you.
a problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will not take 3 minutes. I specifically want to address one part of this proposed legislation. The Secretary of State's office is in favor of House Bill 2717. And you have my written testimony, but I want to look at one particular section as it relates to Section 4 with the identification cards. According to Section 4, a municipal identification card shall not be used to satisfy any requirement of state law for proof of identity. Looking at that in relation to the voter identification requirement that Kansas has currently under Kansas law. In Kansas law, our photo ID law states the following. Acceptable forms of identification include an employee badge or identification document issued by a municipal, county, state, or federal government office or agency. So although we are aware of the language in Section 4, we want to make sure that it's crystal clear that this would not be an acceptable form of identification. It has long been a opinion of the Secretary of State back to statehood that only U.S. citizens are allowed to cast votes. We have seen across the country other local jurisdictions and municipalities beginning to allow non-citizens to vote in their local elections. We want to make sure that this is not the practice in Kansas, and we just want clarification on the potential conflict between those two sections, between Section 4 and existing state law on photo ID. And that is all I have. I'm happy to stand for questions.
Thank you. If you just have a seat, when I finish the other conferees, I will have to take questions. Next up is Jeff Easter, Sedgwick County Sheriff, representing the Kansas Sheriff's Association, Kansas Police Officers Association. Sheriff, are you here?
I am, sir.
You're on WebEx. Please go forward. 3 minutes, please.
Chairman Barker and committee members, I appreciate you giving us the time today. My name is Jeff Easter. I am the legislative chair for the Kansas Sheriff's Association. The biggest thing that we want to point out is HB 2707 would prohibit municipalities from placing law enforcement in a catch-22 position between violating local ordinance or concealing unlawful acts under federal law, thereby obstructing federal investigations. We must be able to freely exchange information with federal authorities, especially when the person violating federal law is recognizing members of our communities. We also know that, and we hear from our migrant communities how they're victims of crime. And so our issue is the folks that are perpetuating those kind of crimes on individuals residing here in Kansas need to be held accountable. We believe that this bill would do that. The Attorney General has addressed Section 3, Section B, how that's going to be amended, which we agree with, and then a Section 5, which needs to be restructured, which we agree with as well. We've discussed those concerns with the Attorney General, but we also urge that you pass those amendments and this go forward. So it gives us the opportunity to still work with our federal partners on this national issue. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
Thank you, Sheriff. And if you would just stand by, we'll get questions after another conferee. Jose Corral does not see what organization you're with, but welcome to Federal State Affairs, sir.
I'm with the organization of a resident of Wyandotte County.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
And I did submit my written or my remarks, but there are slight changes, although my overall position hasn't changed.
Okay.
Good morning. My name is Jose Cabrera, but I go by Pepe. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on support of this bill. I feel uniquely qualified to discuss this topic. You see, my parents are Cuban refugees. My father was arrested and thrown in political prison for speaking out against the Castro regime and for trying to escape the country. When he was only 16, he was released after several months, but refused to remain silent about the direction of his beloved homeland and where was headed, and fled to the United States in 1960 after catching wind that Castro's secret police were going to arrest him again for having the audacity to disagree with the government. Thankfully, he succeeded the second time. A few years later, in 1962, my mother and her sister were put on an airplane to the United States through a church program. She was only 13. My parents met at the airport. and by 1970, my older brother and I were born, and I am forever thankful. A pertinent detail beyond the way my parents came to the United States: my parents settled in the heart of Wyandotte County shortly before I was born in 1970, where I grew up near the parallel exit off 635. So not only am I the son of refugees, I am also a Kansas hometown resident, which I currently live after many years of military service. I tell you the story of my parents' journey to the United States of America for a couple of reasons. First, that I am incredibly sensitive to the immigration debate that has come to the fore within the last decade. And that two, and I want to make this abundantly clear, that I am unequivocally and unapologetically pro-immigration. People who come to this country, for whatever reason, all share the desire to make a better life for themselves and their families. Whether it's to become a permanent citizen or to legally contribute to our labor force on a temporary basis, my devotion to this issue cannot and will not be challenged. My hope is that every city is safe and welcoming. However, there is an important caveat to this phrase that cannot be ignored: that all the efforts to make cities safe and welcoming should work to uphold the law, not to circumvent it. We absolutely do need common sense immigration reform, and we need to build it upon the three pillars of: one, that the process is quick and simple; two, that it's inexpensive for the applicants; and three, and most importantly, that it's secure. Whether people are coming here to live permanently or as temporary workers, we are a nation of laws. This situation is no exception.
You need to wrap it up.
This is my last paragraph, sir.
Thank you. Make it quick.
Cities creating local policies that circumvent federal law may come from a right-hearted place, but the second and third order effects on both the city and the immigrants are more problematic when you're able to peel away the rhetoric and emotion from the issue and look closer. I'm certain that hours will be spent within the committee in this House on those effects, so I won't spend time
Thank you, sir.
during that. Although
Your time has expired. I hate being a referee, but I've got a number of people that want to be heard, and I will give them the opportunity to be heard.
Okay.
Please stand by for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hate to the audience, I hate to have to cut people off, but I have 19 opponents. I'm going to hear from every one of those, and we have an hour and a half in committee. So at times I may appear rude, and I'm sorry for that, but there's a number of people that are here that want to be heard from, and I expect to hear from every one of them. Questions for would direct the committee to the written proponents, Dwayne Beth and Richard Levin. Please read their testimony. We never limit written testimony, and this committee is very good about reading all the testimony. For that purpose, committee, is there questions of the conferees? Yes, Representative Reese.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll direct this question to Mr. Cabrera. Please come to the microphone, please. Mr. Cabrera, when your parents came from Cuba, what was the waiting time for them to become citizens?
Say again, sir.
When your parents came from Cuba, what was the waiting time for them to become citizens, and what was the process?
They were naturalized. And you'll have to forgive me, sir, I don't know the specific wait time on that.
I think back when Castro was taking charge of Cuba, that people that escaped as refugees, when they hit, and correct me if I'm wrong, when they hit the United States, their feet hit the ground, they were citizens, became citizens.
The dry land is that they are issued asylum when they hit the ground.
So I'm looking at what happened in Cuba. Things are still not really right there. We've opened trade with Cuba, and it was war and torn. But would you say that other countries down in South America, El Salvador, Guatemala, some of them also are war torn countries, and maybe could be granted the same type of situation?
I'm just asking for a consolidated policy that is quick, inexpensive, and secure. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Hyberg,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question from Mr. McCaskey.
please.
Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.
I'm looking over the valid IDs for voting according to our statute. And it seems to me the purpose of those forms of ID is to establish the voter's identification, not to prove the voter's citizenship. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, then that's all I needed. Thanks.
Thank you. Representative Hazelwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this question would be for the Attorney General, or for the Sedgwick County Sheriff on what would be the plan, what would be the solution? Because when I look at this, it's my mind automatically goes to racial profiling. It goes to splitting families, and it also targets and disrespects some of our hardworking Kansans in the agriculture state that puts food on our table. What are we going to do? Bust people out to deportation? What's the plan? What's the ultimate goal?
And you're directing it to the sheriff?
Either the sheriff or the Attorney General.
General, if you choose to answer, please, you may.
Well, Sheriff Easter, you owe me one for answering this one. Representative, look, I think your question, which I understand, I get it, but your question goes to the point of why, from my vantage point, we're here today. I mean, those are the big questions, ultimately, in policy in this country. What's going to happen to the people who came here unlawfully and nonetheless are here and may have kids who are citizens or spouses who are citizens, or they've been law-abiding residents for a very long time. They're critically important in the economy in some areas. What's going to happen to folks who aren't here already, to the question I think implied by the ranking minority member. And what's the process by which differently circumstanced folks are dealt with, to your question about, busing, which of course is not what we're advocating. My point is, those are all difficult questions that the unified government is not authorized to answer. And the fact that Congress has failed to answer them does not mean that we ought to have hundreds of local jurisdictions stepping in to end run what law Congress has enacted. That's all we're trying to accomplish here. And in particular, when we talk about end running, I'm talking about from a law enforcement standpoint, which is what's particularly concerned me and what the thrust of this bill is intended to address. It doesn't address the broader questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
thank you. No further questions of the proponents. I'm going to keep us on time, folks. I will close the portion of the bill for the proponents. I will open up the portion for the opponents. First up is Dr. Edwards, Chief of Staff to the Mayor of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County. I think you're on WebEx. Oh, she is? Okay, I'm sorry. 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I am Dr. Mildred Edwards, and as stated, I'm the Chief of Staff to Mayor Tyrone Garner at the Unified Government of Wyandotte County in Kansas City, Kansas. After 5 long years of advocacy, research, legal support, and concern in Wyandotte County, we were finally able to pass the Safe and Welcoming Ordinance. This alone should let you know that we did not take this lightly. It was a decision made by the Board of Commissioners to better serve the residents of Wyandotte County. We have approximately 30% of our population per the U.S. Census to be Hispanic. However, in our school district, we have about 65% of our students are of Hispanic heritage. That lets us know that we have residents in our community that we are not able to track. They are not able to receive support if victimized through our police department. They fear contacting the police if they are in circumstances such as that. We have parents that cannot support their students in the school district because they are afraid to go to the school when necessary. We want to make sure that Wyandotte County is a place that it is safe for you to raise a family. So we are against House Bill 2717 because we want to make sure that we are providing what is necessary to sustain our current workforce, our current population, and our current economy through the residents that we currently have. And so we ask that you please consider the impacts that your decision will have on Wyandotte County as a whole.
Thank you, Doctor. And if you'll remain in the room to stand for questions at a later time, thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is Alejandro Lopez, New Frontier Projects. Good job, Chairman. Thank you. Please, you have 2 minutes.
All right. Chairman Barker, Vice Chair Arnberger, and esteemed members of the committee. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to testify before this committee today regarding passage of HB 2717. My name is Alejandro Rangel Lopez, and I'm a junior from KU, or at KU from Dodge City, studying public administration and political science. I'm here to speak with you today to urge you to vote against this harmful piece of legislation. And I'm going to cut to the chase here because I only have 2 minutes. You may say that this legislation does not target legal immigrants, those that are undocumented, or only those that are undocumented. However, the harsh reality is that many of us, including me up until a few years ago, lived in mixed status families. That is, families where some are so-called legal immigrants and others who were not as fortunate are undocumented and living in the shadows of society, doing many of the jobs that employers are now struggling to fill. It is because of this reality that folks are scared of approaching their local law enforcement out of fear that they or a loved one will be deported, even if a legitimate crime has been committed. That's what stopped my mom from reporting her abusive ex-husband. That's what delayed her justice and cost her her right to see my 2 older siblings grow up as they were kidnapped by her ex-husband and taken to Mexico. This happened in the year 2001, and she couldn't see them until she got her green card this year, 21 years later. Our immigration system is broken and everybody agrees there. However, the answer isn't to weaponize a community's police force against its immigrant population. Prohibiting communities from making decisions that are in the best interest of their residents does nothing but instill fear in our state's most hardworking people. Just like anyone else, immigrants and their families want to be able to approach a police officer without having to worry about whether someone they love is at risk of being detained. An officer's duty is to protect their local community, not serve as an agent of big government. In closing, I want to urge you to vote against HB 2717. Thank you all for your time, and I hope you take my testimony into consideration in your decision.
Thank you, and thank you for being on time. Next up is Monsignor Stuart Swedlin, Kansas Interfaith Action. Good morning, Monsignor.
Good morning. I'm Monsignor Stuart Swedlin. I'm a Wyandotte County resident, a lifelong Republican, a rare bird in Wyandotte. And I'm the president of Donnelly College and pastor of Our Lady in St. Rose Catholic Church. Today I represent Kansas Interfaith Action, where I'm a board member. I oppose and ask you to oppose House Bill 2717 for 3 reasons. We should value and respect local decision-making in government. That's a fundamental Republican principle, which my dad ran on when he ran for office as a Republican. Second, because our immigration laws and systems are badly broken, and we refuse to address the need for comprehensive immigration reform on a national level, local communities need to be able to craft common sense local remedies that mitigate the worst effects of a broken system on local communities, businesses, families, and individuals. Third, the safe and welcoming legislation passed in Wyandotte County will make our county safer and improve economic development by allowing everyone to participate and to feel able to seek police help without fear for their families or themselves being adversely affected by the dysfunctional immigration system. As a college president, I've seen firsthand families and individuals who have been victims of crime who have hesitated to seek police help because of the immigration status for themselves or members of their family. And as a former resident in Illinois, I have seen municipal cards, really increase economic development in the county of Champaign in Illinois when we did something similar back in the 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you, Monsignor. Next up is Michael Rubin, Roland Park City Council, and safe and welcoming. Good morning, sir. You have 2 minutes.
All right. Good morning, committee. Thank you for hearing me today. I want to say my name is Michael Redney. I'm a teacher in Wyandotte County. I'm a Roland Park City Council member. Today, I'd like to share with you why House Bill 2717 is unnecessary government overreach and it should be voted down. In Roland Park, we spent nearly 2 years in research, discussion, and negotiation for how best to implement an ordinance that would provide better inclusion for all of our residents. In Wyandotte County, over 5 years was spent on the advocacy process to clearly determine what is best for the community. In that time, the local community spoke clearly and consistently that putting in safeguards around police collaboration with ICE is what we and they want. As a teacher, I know that students and their families are afraid to get further engaged in their communities, and this includes searching for jobs that are in the most need. House Bill 2717 will make the economy worse and harm business owners. My students are afraid to apply for college and scholarships or participate in extracurricular opportunities out of fear that they or their families will be scrutinized by immigration authorities, regardless of their citizenship status. This is bad for our society and economy if we are forcing motivated and skilled students out of the pursuit of their dreams. Our communities have also clearly decided that we do not want our limited resources spent on needless immigration enforcement by local police. To make a mandate like House Bill 2717 does is the worst example of what some call big government, expensive and unnecessary. HB 2717 is a bad bill that will cause wasteful government spending, damage the economy, make us less safe, and harm the lives of people, especially children. I urge you to abandon it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next up would be Raja Nazir, Loud Light. Good morning and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
I appreciate you all for giving me the time to testify.
You'll need to hit the button on the microphone. The blue light should come on.
Is it on?
Red, okay. Mine's blue.
Can you hear me okay?
We can't. Go right ahead.
I appreciate you all for giving me the time to testify before the committee today in regard to HB 2717. My name is Raja Nazir, and I'm a senior at Wichita State University and born in Wichita, Kansas. I've joined you all today to discuss why voting against HB 2717 is imperative for the well-being and safety of Kansas residents. As a child of immigrants, I'm a friend to many who identify as such. I've seen firsthand the obstacles immigrants have faced when trying to create a promising and safe life for themselves and their families. My parents immigrated to Kansas in the 90s from Lahore, Pakistan, and have since worked tirelessly to create a solid future for their 3 kids in a state that welcomed them with open arms. Without the fearlessness and sacrifices of my parents had to make in order to move to Kansas, I would not be standing in front of you today. HB 2717 would create a fearful rhetoric against vulnerable immigrant populations, and they are not safe in addition to, vulnerable populations that they are not safe in addition to fearing for their lives in a new environment. Although the thought behind this bill may have been to create a more organized immigrant population in Kansas, it will undoubtedly instill hesitance and distrust of law enforcement, documented or not. Instead of resorting to local law enforcement for assistance, residents will see them as their oppressor. This bill also violates the rights of local communities and government to create regulations to best represent them and their residents. When making decisions from the state level, the interests and asks of particular districts are neglected and create a further distrust in their local government. I hope you take into consideration the perspectives of innocent and hardworking Kansans who do nothing but provide the best for their families and their state. They should not fear that they are punished for doing so. If this bill passes, residents in the state will be stripped of their rights to seek a better life and be protected by our state. Their American dreams should not become nightmares.
Thank you. Next up is Reverend Rick Brothen, Grandview Park Presbyterian Church. Good morning, sir, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Good morning. Thank you for hearing me today. I am Rick Behrens from Kansas City, Kansas. I'm pastor of Grandview Park Presbyterian Church, a member of Air Board, and the chair of the Law Enforcement Advisory Board for Kansas City, Kansas. I would state up front that both Chief Oakman and Sheriff Sopcich indicated that neither of them are opposed to the Safe and Welcoming Act. However, I am very opposed to this bill that we are debating today. For the past 40 years, I have lived and pastored in the Central Avenue neighborhood of Kansas City, Kansas. I watched in the 1980s and the early 1990s as our all-white neighborhood, community, and businesses were drying up and blowing away. Central Avenue was becoming a ghost town, but in the mid-1990s, immigrants began to arrive who wanted to be in our community. In a short span of 10 years, our neighborhood and community became vibrant and full again. The vacant storefronts on Central Avenue began to fill up and families found homes. But those families who built our community continue to live in the shadows, afraid to report crimes, afraid to participate in community groups, oftentimes even afraid to go out, and with good reason. Because reporting a crime or simply a broken taillight could result in a broken family. The same families who created a vibrant community now live in fear. These families easily make up 1/4 of the community population in Wyandotte County. We can't fix a broken immigration system, but we can take care of those whom God has placed in our midst. We can care for those who have made our neighborhoods vibrant and who have become our neighbors and our fellow church members. This bill calls for the exact opposite. It will not only hurt our neighbors, it will hurt all of us, making us less safe, making us less economically viable, and worst of all, making us less human. Loving God means loving our neighbors, and this bill does none of that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next up is Marcus Wynn, Safe and Welcoming Coalition. Good morning, sir, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Good morning, Chairman Barker and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. My name is Marcus Wynn. I live in Kansas City, Kansas, and I speak on behalf of the Safe and Welcoming Coalition of Wyandotte County. I will try to be brief. We are strongly opposed to HB 2717. Our local policy has been mischaracterized as justification for this bill. But this hearing is not ultimately a referendum on the Safe and Welcoming Act. Instead, it's about the dangerous overreach and the erosion of home rule created by HB 2717. We need not agree on local policy to share a commitment to the principle of home rule. HB 2717 infringes every local government in Kansas, creating unfunded mandates on already overworked and underfunded local law enforcement agencies, all the while not increasing public safety. If the distinguished Attorney General really wants to change local policy in Wyandotte County, he should be running for KCK mayor. State officials, however, should not seek to restrict the liberty of local communities to govern their own affairs. Whether you agree with particular local decisions, we ask this committee to stand up for the freedom of local communities, refrain from setting dangerous precedent, and protect local decision-making. Please don't pass this bill. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, sir. Next up is Sister Teresa, Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth. Sister, are you? Thank you, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Thank you. And can somebody give me a thumbs up when I have 20 seconds left? Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Barker and committee. I am Sister Teresa Bangert, a Sister of Charity of Leavenworth. I like to remind legislators that our pioneer sisters landed in Leavenworth in 1858, and we served people in Kansas before even Kansas was a state. All of us, when we came into this room this morning, all of us had to walk by the beautiful mural on Brown versus Board. That mural, for me, is such a powerful depiction of a struggle in our country and the confrontation of unjust laws. At the beginning of this legislative session, Alan Cobb, the CEO of the Kansas Chamber, did a podcast with a local journalist. He stated that the major concern of businesses in Kansas is the workforce. And I would note, he didn't say their major concern is taxes. All of us know the immigration system is broken, and it's been broken for a long time. We need workers. The Kansas unemployment rate is 2.6%, the lowest rate in a decade. In Kansas City, Kansas, we want workers and their families to know that we both welcome them and we value them. As a person of faith, my being in front of you today goes deeper than the practical about workers. I belong to a church that works for justice for immigrants and asks me and the members to do the same. The Immigrant and Refugee Committee of the Catholic Bishops recently joined the Alliance for New Immigration Consensus. They have worked on Capitol Hill for Congress to do something about this, which they have not. I'm glad you and this committee have the morning hour because you get tough issues, and immigration is one of them. So I want to conclude by anticipating the celebration of St. Patrick with a blessing for you. May the Kansas roads rise up to meet you. May the prairie winds be always at your back. May the rain fall soft upon your fields and your hearts. And until we meet again, may God keep Kansas safe and welcoming. And may you be held in the palm of God's hand. Thank you for hearing me this morning.
Thank you, sister, and thank you for the blessing. Next up is Logan Bird. Mr. Bird here don't have an organization. Oh, you got? Okay. I guess it can go either way, Logan. Good morning, and could you tell us what organization, if you're with an organization?
I'm a private citizen.
Very well, thank you. Go forward.
So Chairman Barker, Vice Chair Arnberger, and members of the committee, I appreciate you all giving me the time to give testimony before the committee today. My name is Logan Bird, and I'm a junior at Wichita State University. I have joined you all today to discuss why voting against HB 2717 is imperative for the well-being and safety of Kansas residents. This proposed bill is an attack on small government in Kansas. HB 2717 creates an unfunded state mandate on local police to enforce federal law, even though our police are already stretched with local mental health, gun violence, and substance abuse cases. Immigration law is federal law. There is neither funding for nor any requirement that local police or sheriffs enforce or cooperate in the enforcement of immigration law, actions for which they are not trained. The Safe and Welcoming Act, in fact, does not ban cooperation with federal immigration authorities if the public safety is at risk. What the Safe and Welcoming Ordinance does is set boundaries and clear guidelines as to what level of cooperation a municipality should have with federal agencies like ICE, but in no way does it prohibit that cooperation. On top of all of this, this bill would create a fearful rhetoric within the immigrant population in Wyandotte County, whether documented or not, further causing strain on the relationship between the people and the police. I strongly urge you all to vote against this bill today, and thank you so much for letting me testify.
Thank you, Logan. Next, we have Monica Vargas. Welcome to committee.
Good morning. My name is Monica Vargas. I am here as the political director of the UFCW Union Food and Commerce Workers District Union Local 2. We represent over 11,000 workers working in the food supply and retail industries in the state of Kansas, among others in the state of Missouri and Oklahoma. I'm also here as an immigration attorney and as an immigrant and resident of the state of Kansas. There are so many reasons I oppose this bill, but I want to say first, as an immigration attorney, I want to ratify what is being mentioned by most opponents. This bill affects directly mixed status families. We have 106,933 families living in these mixed status families, and 54,000 of those are U.S. citizens. We also want to say, as representative of the UFCW, that these immigrants, foreign-born immigrants, workers, make up for 4% of the food supply, and we work closely with some of the largest employers in the state. We are very aware of the shortage of workforce, and we have worked through years with these companies to improve the system. This kind of bills discourage immigrants to work. We are saying here that their families are affected. And third, I want to say, as a resident of Kansas, that this issue is one that attains federal enforcement law. Immigration infractions are civil infractions. They are not crimes, and they should be. And the sources of our police departments shouldn't be wasted in enforcement laws instead of taking care of public safety. I appreciate your time, and I'm willing to take any question that you may have. Thank you.
Next is Caleb Smith with Kansas Appleseed Center of Law and Justice on WebEx.
Thank you very much. Members of the House Federal and State Affairs Committee, my name is Caleb Smith, Inclusive Campaign Director with Kansas Appleseed. Thank you for giving us a minute to discuss the effects of HB 2717. Kansas Appleseed opposes this legislation because Kansas is a better state when we are welcoming and inclusive. This bill undermines Kansas values: unity, prosperity, and self-determination, while weakening our economy and making our communities less safe. Kansas should welcome immigrants with dignity, compassion, and with full participation in our communities and equal protection of the law. Immigrants are essential, and their contributions make our state stronger, while many have come in Kansas, in fact, to seek safety. As a matter of fact, right now, as the world watches, we all condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, while our hearts break for the families torn apart by such needless violence. It's devastating times like these that underscore how important it is for everyone to have a safe place to thrive and to raise their families without fear. Our state's future and well-being is at stake. According to a recent study, counties with welcoming or sanctuary policies are safer and have stronger economies than counties without these policies, even while controlling for a broad range of demographic characteristics. This study found welcoming counties had 35.5 fewer crimes committed per 10,000 residents compared to these non-sanctuary counties, and with median household incomes of over $4,000 higher, a poverty rate of over 2% lower, and an unemployment rate that was over 1% lower. Furthermore, the preemption measure proposed in this bill are just bad policy. It prevents communities from taking the actions that they've decided are best for their community. This keeps Kansans from learning the best solutions about how public policies work in practice. So preventing local communities from enacting policies that support and protect immigrants is also detrimental to public health. Bills like this only serve to increase a climate of hostility and fear that adds to stress and reluctance to seek services.
You need to close it down. You've had your minute. Go ahead.
All right.
Give you
This threatens the welfare not only of immigrants, but also the welfare and social fabric of the broader communities. And for these reasons, we strongly oppose H. Bill 2717. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Next up is Chloe Chafin. Good morning, ma'am, and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Good morning. Thank you to the committee for letting me give my testimony today. I hope that you will all look to my written comment, but I do have just a few things that I would like to highlight. Number one, talking about the requirements that this bill would put on municipal IDs. I think that a lot has been made about citizenship and voting and voter fraud, but I want to say that that is completely unfounded. Number one, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud in Kansas, but beyond that, as a young person who to vote in person one time, but when I did, I voted by showing my Washburn University student ID. This is already a permitted form of ID that is given to young people in this state, and yet there are many people who have that ID and who are not citizens, but who do not vote because there are other backstops to prevent that form of voter fraud. That is a completely redundant fear, and that's not based in fact. I would also like to point out that when we have these debates, there is an opportunity cost. When we are having this conversation right now for something that has not been proven to be an issue before, then we are just disincentivizing people from getting involved in the political process because they feel less welcomed. We are also making sure that we are using this time on this and therefore not having other needed debates about how we can have reform that will actually help Kansans, unlike this bill before us today, which I urge you to oppose. The second thing I would like to point out is the 2020 census, where it was found that 80 of 105 counties lost population. And it worries me that we don't seem to have a sense of urgency about that. It's not a secret that the counties that are actually growing in population are the ones that have greater protection for people like these. When we focus on this bill and make people feel less welcome, especially those living in those rural areas that are dropping in population, it's only logical that they might leave the state of Kansas to go to our neighbor Colorado, which is entirely a sanctuary state. What we are doing is we are telling people that Midwestern nice does not exist here. Please oppose this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Caroline Dean.
Written only.
Some is on. Written only, okay. All right. Angela Ferguson. Good morning and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Barker and the committee members for allowing me to testify today. I'm here standing up on behalf of my family, friends, and Kansas businesses who hire immigrants. And I'm asking for justice for immigrants. And I ask each of you, what justice are you standing for today? I'm an immigration attorney with 35 years of experience representing many of your constituents. I oppose HB 2717. Why? Because this bill will impact the economy in Kansas. It will make it harder for employers to get the valuable workers that they need. And it will require Kansas to enforce federal immigration law. It costs cities and counties a lot of money to do that grunt work for the Department of Homeland Security. And Homeland Security has a $90 billion budget to enforce their immigration laws. It's an unfunded mandate and it should be rejected. Your public safety will be harmed if this bill becomes law because immigrants will be afraid to report crimes. They will be afraid of the police, and that will result in more criminals going free because the witnesses will not be there to testify. Finally, this bill is pure government overreach, telling Wyandotte County and Kansas cities what they cannot do to protect the immigrant residents in their counties, and basically doing the opposite of the policy of Department of Homeland Security, where immigration officers are instructed to use positive discretion for the immigrants while they're doing their jobs. If we were to be a welcoming state, we would flip this bill and make a uniform welcoming policy for the 700 municipalities in Kansas to not enforce federal immigration law.
Thank you. You'll
Please vote no, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Rubai Perez. Oh, there you are. Thank you. Good morning and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Ruby Perez Vasquez. I'm currently a sophomore at Donnelly College in Wyandotte County, Kansas. I'm also co-founder of Students for Social Justice, a student-led organization at Donnelly, and I'm here today opposing House Bill 2717. According to Donnelly's website, in 2016, there were over 33 different countries represented among the student body. That is at least 33 people who migrated to the state of Kansas. 33 people who live, eat, work, go to school, have built families, and found community in Kansas. 33 people who are already living here and who deserve to feel safe and welcomed. House Bill 2717 will not only cause more mental health issues due to living in constant fear and anxiety of being deported within our immigrant communities, but it will cause even more public harm and violence. Immigrants already don't trust federal law enforcement. Therefore, don't report crimes they witness or experience. And that isn't safe for anyone in our communities, not just immigrants. Everyone's safety is at stake, if House Bill 2717 is passed. Please vote no on House Bill 2717. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Next up, Sarah Wagner, Rosedale Development Association. Good morning and welcome to Federal and State Affairs.
Good morning. My name is Sarah Wagner with Rosedale Development Association, a neighborhood revitalization nonprofit in Kansas City, Kansas, and I am asking you to oppose HB 2717. This bill would be detrimental to our community. The Kansas City, Kansas Police Department has an active community policing branch that has a great relationship with the neighborhoods due to mutual involvement. The officers attend neighborhood meetings, volunteer, and have relationships with local leaders. In turn, residents feel safe in their communities and trust in the local police. This trust is damaged by news of ICE raids and tips from the local police officers. Keeping the local police focused on local issues and ensuring the safety of all residents is what Wyandotte County needs and what the residents want. Also, as a lifelong Kansas resident, I oppose this bill. Immigrant communities have economically and culturally revived Kansas City, Kansas, and made our community stronger and better. These residents, who are our neighbors, our families, and our friends, are not to blame for the lack of federal reform in immigration. I again ask you to please vote no on House Bill 2717.
Thank you so much. The next conferee is on WebEx, Maureen Horowitz. WebEx.
Hi,
Maureen.
thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. 1999, and as a Hungarian American Jew, I find HB 2717 chilling. My grandmother came to this country 7 months pregnant with my mother, 3 years before the United States restricted immigration from the countries Jews were fleeing, and exactly 2 of the Jews in the Hungarian village where she'd grown up survived the Nazi camps. My grandmother was like a third parent to me. Her brother, my great-uncle Abi, was one of the 2 Jews who survived. He described coming home to find both his immediate family and his Jewish community had been slaughtered, and his longtime neighbors had moved themselves into his house and were eating at his table, still challenging his right to be in his own home. And as a child, I found the story, it left me more confused than angry. How exactly did his neighbors stop hoping that my family survived and instead decide to take everything they had and be so sure it was rightfully theirs that once they heard Jews were liberated from the concentration camps, they still felt entitled to everything my great uncle had worked for? I think it must have happened little by little, slowly believing that people like me are less human than people like them, until they believed my family deserved nothing and they, the quote-unquote real citizens of Hungary, deserved everything. I'd like to believe that Kansans are better than this, that we don't say those people who are our neighbors deserve less, but that's the barely hidden subtext of HB 2717. Why else would people who normally complain about government overreach now say that state government needs to play Big Brother, step in and override the elected officials of municipalities who've crafted regulations based on what actually works in our communities? Or pretend that Wyandotte County's already clearly labeled Municipal ID is at risk of being mistaken for a state ID. We all know that the federal government has failed to pass meaningful immigration reform, and that failure has left too many of our neighbors vulnerable to exploitation and exposed to violence. This proposed
Thank you, ma'am. You need to wrap it up.
I am. This proposed legislation is a cynical attempt to worsen those conditions and pit neighbor against neighbor, letting the state decide who deserves less and who should be left vulnerable. I hope you will choose decency and kill HB 2717. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Next up is Victoria Arcano on WebEx.
Hello, my name is Victoria Arcano. I speak in opposition to HB 2717. I lived in Kansas City, Kansas, and I worked for the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department until 2020. I'm a social worker and an advocate for survivors of domestic violence. I witnessed the bias of city and county employees due to the lack of the Safe and Welcoming Act. It is not policy to call ICE, but it happens. I have seen it happen. And the impact on survivors is dangerous for all residents. If survivors of domestic violence know ICE will be called by police when seeking protection, they will not seek protection. This cuts off access to safety and limits the city's ability to prosecute violent crimes. Even if a crime victim summons the courage to call police, many fear going to court to testify. Instead, they suffer in silence. You need to guarantee that deportation is not a factor weighing on survivors of violence when they seek safety. Thank you. Again, I speak in opposition of HB 2717.
Thank you very much. I have no other opponents that wish to testify orally. I do have a number of written opponents. Committee, if you'll look at your agenda, I think there's 46 testimonies that you need to be reading. With that, I'll open it up for questions of the opponents. Representative Reese, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll direct this question to Dr. Mildred Edwards from the Mayor's office. Yes. Dr. Edwards, thanks for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Could you give us a brief description on what the local ID is and what it's supposed to intent is?
So the intent of the municipal ID is to allow an individual to be identified. It will help in situations such as those that are unbanked and unable to cash their payroll checks. About 50% of our utility bills at the UG are paid in cash because we have so many residents that do not have bank accounts. This will allow them to open bank accounts. It is not an ID that could be used to access social benefits. What it is really intended to do is for us to know who's in our community and how might we be able to adequately identify them in an effort to make their lives safer and to allow the county to provide for their needs as we deem fit.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
You may.
Doctor, is there any background checks done before these IDs are issued? If you know that the person applying maybe have a felony in another country, just based on what your research is that part of this agenda to get those IDs out to?
It is not. The ID is not used for the purpose of purporting that an individual hasn't committed a crime. I don't think our driver's license do that either. I think the ID is just given for the purpose of them being known, who they are in the community and how we might be able to track their needs and they be able to access the benefits of the community that they deserve, such as safety through our police department.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question of you. So what do you require for them to get an ID? Do they have to have some type of identification or do they just come in and say, this is my name, this is my date of birth?
Yes, they would have to have the proper documentation in order to prove their identity. And there are individuals here.
And what is that?
There are individuals that were on the Safe and Welcoming Policy Ordinance writing team that I would welcome them to tell you exactly what that documentation is.
Okay. With that, excuse me, with that, Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question for Dr. Edwards as well. As you may know, in New York City, they passed a law that would allow up to 800,000 non-citizens the right to vote in municipal elections. Does the unified government of Wyandotte, is there an intention to move in that direction?
That is not a part of our ordinance. It is not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Miller. And this will be the last, not the last question, but the last question on my list. Just looking at the time. Representative Miller, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It may already be in some of our testimony, and I just haven't found it. Can we get a copy of one of these safe and welcoming ordinances? It would answer questions like the ones
I was going to ask Connie get one in research. There's one out there. It's in your file, I believe.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Did you have a question?
Yes, and if we could get a written response, I don't need this answer now, but I would like to know from the reviser of Section 4 of 2717 overrides or how it conflicts with KSA 25, 2908, Section H1E. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll get the revisor to respond to that. I would also like to have anyone that would like to supply what is the criteria used to issue these, and they can do it in writing. I'm just looking
I
at
think you can do it off the cuff if you're interested.
All right.
Okay, bear with me here. We have item 5A, proof of identity. To establish identity, an applicant shall be required to produce one of the following documents that is an original or a copy certified by the issuing agency and be current or expired not more than 5 years prior to the date of the municipal ID application. A U.S. or foreign passport, a U.S. state driver's license, a U.S. state identification card, a U.S. permanent resident card, also known as a green card, a consular identification card, a photo identification card with name, address, date of birth, and expiration date issued by another country to its citizens or nationals as an alternative to a passport for re-entry in the issuing country. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services employment authorization, U.S. certification of nationalization, U.S. certificate of citizenship, a national identification card with photo, name, address, date of birth, and expiration date, released offender identification from the State Department of Corrections, U.S. or foreign military identification card, U.S. military dependent identification card, U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs card, U.S. Department of Justice inmate identification card. Concealed carry permit issued by any state, territory, or possession of the U.S. Student ID card from an accredited educational institution, a tribal driver's license or identification card, or public assistance ID card issued by a government office.
Thank you. And if you'd be so kind, if you could forward that
to
our committee secretary so we can get it out to committee.
We will make certain that you have the full ordinance. Thank you all.
And with that, Representative Penn, you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I had a couple of questions, but I'll direct the first one to Dr. Edwards, if I may. Dr. Edwards, your testimony was that you had 13% of Hispanic or Hispanic heritage inside of your census by the U.S. and over 65% in the schools. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Very well. There was testimony that was given that said that the police were, quote, have a great relationship with local police in the community, that they attend local meetings and have great rapport. Your testimony was that that the community is victimized by the police and that you want to make sure that it's a safe place to raise a family. In my mind's eye, that would mean that you would need police to provide that safety. What is your position on abolishing the police in your community?
I apologize if that was what you heard. What I said is that our residents, if they are being victimized, should be able to access support from the police.
Thank you, madam. Are they being victimized? Do you have
Crimes
documentation?
occur in communities throughout all cities in the state of Kansas. So if they are victimized through some crime, they should be able to contact and call the police.
Could you please answer my question? What is your position on abolishing the police in the community?
It has no relevance here.
Really? Okay.
Thank you. Last question, Representative Wagner.
Oh, I got another one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'll go with you, Ms. Edwards. I've heard many of the opponents of this say that somehow this would be a solution, an economic boon and a solution as far as on the workforce. But in the ordinance, which we have a copy of, it says, as far as your own government, the United Government shall comply with federal and state laws regarding employment eligibility and employment records, such as the I-9 verification process, but shall not otherwise collect other information. The question is on being an employer, the I-9 status, that if a person does not have proof of U.S. citizenship or a green card, that you are not eligible to hire them. So am I not correct in saying that the policy of your government is that you still would not hire somebody who is not an actual legal immigrant to the United States?
the ID form does permit us to have some knowledge of who this individual is without them being citizens. And so your question is, would we not hire them if they weren't a citizen?
The question is somebody who's not otherwise a documented green card holder or otherwise has proof of legal residency, that your own government would still not hire them. Is that not
Our
correct?
government would not hire someone who is not a legal citizen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Committee, we've taken the questions, and we've done it within the time frame that I was given. I want to thank the audience. I do, for your patience. Playing the timekeepers like being a ref in a basketball court. Sometimes you think there's a foul and maybe there's not a foul, but you can call them as you see them. I want to thank you for all of you coming here. You have contact information on all the committee members. You may contact them at some point in time. We will work this bill. We would like your input. And again, thank you for coming here today. And with that, committee, is there other business for the committee? We are working tomorrow. I think I gave you the list. I can't give you what order. Some of the bills will take longer than others. But if there's nothing else for the good of the committee, we are adjourned.